What are the best last words in the history? Story 1. For all the younger people, 9/11 also changed how hijacking was viewed. Before then, you cooperated with the hijackers. You were a hostage. If you cooperate, there's a good chance they'll let you go. You're a bargaining chip, they want you in good health. That's why people didn't fight back in the other planes. Fighting back was more dangerous than cooperating. The only reason they fought back was because one of them called their family and heard about the other strikes. They realized they were going to die anyway. This was essentially the first time in modern history that resisting hijackers was a good idea. If that call didn't go through, or there was less time between strikes so it couldn't be told to them, that plane would have hit. And the most likely target was the White House. These people stood on the turning point of history, and recognized that. So they turned it the other way as much as they could. Story 2. Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most loyal marshals, ordered his own execution after they lost the war. On December 6, 1815, Ney was condemned, and on December 7, 1815 he was executed by firing squad in Paris. He refused to wear a blindfold and was allowed the right to give the order to fire, reportedly saying, "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order. It will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France, and not one against her. Soldiers, fire!" Story 3. Not sure if it was his last words, but he was executed shortly later. Erwin von Witzleben, after being sentenced to death by the Nazis for an attempt to kill Hitler. You can turn us over to the executioner. In 3 months the outraged and tormented people will call you to account and drag you through the filth in the streets alive. He was hung with a meat hook and a piano wire by Hitler's direct orders. Story 4. I know this is often repeated, but she did not say this on the scaffold. If she had, then Marillac and Chapuis would have recorded it, and it is certain that her family would have paid a high price. She was only 19 and so weak and tired that she could barely speak. Marillac records that she said she merited 100 deaths for so offending the king who had treated her so graciously. She then prayed for the king and his welfare and prosperity before kneeling and placing her head on the block. From my study of this time, I am certain that Culpeper abused and, if there had been sexual activity, something denied by both, raped her. He was a thoroughly repulsive man who had raped before. Let's not forget that she was convicted of offending against the king with Dereham before she was even presented to court. At that point, the best she could have hoped for was to marry a noble and not die in childbirth. There was no notion that this barely literate girl living in what was essentially a boarding house for the abandoned nobility would ever be queen. The injustice of her situation must have truly bewildered her. Story 5. I like Julius Caesar's last words. In the Shakespeare play he says, "Et tu, brute? Then fall, Caesar." The "Et tu, brute" part is based on what we historically think Caesar said, but he was thought to have said it in Greek. Kai su teknon, which translates to, "And thou, child." However, Kai su teknon at that time was used like slang or colloquially to mean, "You too, kid," in an insulting or condescending manner. So, it is possible that on being stabbed by his friend and ally and betrayed by his colleagues, Caesar was not lamenting and questioning this betrayal with a melancholy, "Even you, Brutus?" but more giving Brutus the middle finger. Story 6. Can't remember the exact words, but it was between two pilots. They realized the plane was going down and started joking about it. That night I listened to a bunch of people realizing their plane was going to crash. Most people were freaking or screaming. These two guys were like, "Fuck it, this is what's happening and it's fine." Also kind of reminds me when a news crew was going around and interviewing people after a man had been arrested for selling human meat in meat pies. Everyone else was upset, but those two guys weren't. In both cases they were like, fuck it, life happens and we might as well go along with it. They chose not to get upset in a situation they had no control over and went with it. I wish I could be like that. Story 7. In a Silliman lecture. John von Neumann, who was dying at the time, wrote some of the most splendid sentences he wrote in all his life. He pointed out that there were good grounds merely in terms of electrical analysis to show that the mind, the brain itself, could not be working on a digital system. It did not have enough accuracy, or it did not have enough memory. And he wrote some classical sentences saying there is a statistical language in the brain, different from any other statistical language that we use. This is what we have to discover. I think we shall make some progress along the lines of looking for what kind of statistical language would work. Story 8. Take it with a grain of salt, as I believe this to be unconfirmed. But when he was nearing the end, Graham Chapman was having a needle for in 4 and said fuck when it went in. Supposedly his last words were to the nurse that stuck him with the needle. Sorry for saying fuck. I've also seen that his last word was hello when his son came into the room. Not a famous person, but the last words my dad said to me were, I love you too. Personally, I think those words are the best. Chapman comes in second. Story 9. My daddy? He hadn't spoken in almost 2 days. As the priest is standing over him, giving him the last rites. Priest is getting wordy, and slightly dramatic. Without opening his eyes, my daddy says, Jesus Christ, enough already! Badass from beginning to end. My sister and I were silently laughing so hard we were crying. Everyone thought we were grief-stricken crying, nope. Just dying listening to our daddy be our dad, up to the very end. A badass who was our best friend, but couldn't stand the dramatics. Story 10. Today will be hard. Perhaps not his last words, but his last words spoken that everyone can agree upon. Robert François Damiens, a French domestic servant found guilty of attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. Considering the severity of the crime, a brutal and public execution was to proceed. Over the day, before he died, Damiens would have his feet crushed by the boots, have hot pincers shear off pieces of skin, have hot sulfur burn his right hand, have molten wax, then lead, then boiling oil poured into the wounds caused by the pincers and sulfur, have his genitals sliced off, have his arms and legs tied to horses to be dismembered, have the ligaments in his arms and legs cut after the first dismemberment failed, be successfully dismembered by horses, have his possibly still living torso burned at the stake. Fetched from his prison cell that morning, Damiens proclaimed, Today will be hard.